Welcome to the world of nightmares and spooky mysteries. If you appreciate chilling stories and want to dive into the world of scary stories with us, don't forget to subscribe. If you liked it, put a like, and if you want to tickle the nerves of your friends or acquaintances, share these videos. We want to know what scares you the most, where you're from, and what horrors you'd like to hear in the next episodes. Your comments will help us make these stories even more scary and frightening. Thank you for letting us know that fear is not a barrier for you, but a path to the unknown. My name is Stan, I'm 38 years old, and I live in Pennsylvania, in the small town of Valefield. I'm a regular person. I don't consider myself crazy, and I've never believed in all those stories about ghosts and poltergeists. I like to listen to scary bedtime stories, but no more. There's a logical, scientific explanation for everything, so I thought. But what's been going on in my house for the past few months has confused me. I can't explain it. I'll start at the beginning. I'm an architect. I earn enough to support myself. 5 years ago, I designed and built this house myself. It was my dream project. I put my heart and soul into it. No one lived or died here, so for those who immediately think of some ghosts of former tenants, forget it. For the first 3 years, everything was fine. Life went on as usual. But then the weirdness started. First, the air conditioning system. It started switching on and off by itself. I called in the specialists and they couldn't find anything. They changed a couple of sensors just in case, but it didn't help. Then the light problems started, but only in one room on the first floor. The lights were flickering on and off. I called the electricians again, but they couldn't find anything either. I didn't notice it right away. I put it down to technical problems. But what happened 4 months ago started to raise doubts in me. I'm not going to write about things going missing. No, it was simpler than that. When you live alone, you know where things are, where you put them. And it will be exactly where you put it or left it. It's a habit. For guests at home, I'll say this. Yes, there are guests and girls stay overnight. I'm a normal man. But after guests always put in order, and objects again take their permanent place. But I started to notice that things started to change their usual position or place a little bit. For example, everyone drinks coffee in the morning. And since I live alone, I have to get up and go make it myself. And by habit, still sleepy, I reach out my hand to take the coffee, pour it into the machine, and in a couple of minutes, I drink my morning drink to cheer up. But the problem is that many times I've come across the fact that the bag is farther away than usual, and I can't get it easily as always. I have to reach for it, but I know where I always put it. It seems like a small thing, but when you have a lot of them, it's a problem. I didn't pay attention to it at first. Then I tried to convince myself it was fatigue. Lots of work, lack of sleep, stress. I made hundreds of excuses. But the doors opening and closing on their own was harder to explain. Drafts, maybe, or problems with the locks. I made excuses for all of it. When my brother and his family came to visit, the house seemed to settle down. A fortnight passed without incident, and I thought it was all a figment of my imagination. But on the day of their departure, something happened that left me confused. Camille, my brother's daughter, only 3 years old, stood at the door as they were about to leave. She waved and smiled at me, then turned in the opposite direction to where the stairs to the first floor began, and, looking into the void, said clearly, "Bye." You know, you can always explain it away by saying that many children have developed imaginations and have imaginary friends. But are they imaginary? From the moment Camille waved into the void, things got worse in the house. I started to hear footsteps, but it wasn't just stomping. It was more like someone carefully sneaking across the house, trying not to attract attention. One night, I distinctly heard someone walking around upstairs. My heart raced and I rushed upstairs, sure that someone had broken into the house while I was at work. I checked all the rooms. Not a soul. Windows closed, doors locked. But the strange feeling that I wasn't alone wouldn't let go. A couple of days later, I heard a child's laughter. A clear, joyful laugh, as if someone was playing, but There were no children in the house. The laughter was coming from the first floor. I ran upstairs again, but nothing. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, overwork, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And what had happened a fortnight ago had turned everything upside down. I got home late, around 10:30 p.m. On entering the house, I rang my friend, asking how he'd got on. Then I tidied up, lay down on the sofa in the living room, and closed my eyes, just to relax after a long day. But soon, I was awakened by a creak. The creaking of the floor. I sat up abruptly and stared at the doorway leading to the corridor. What I saw made my heart stop. There was a dark figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't a person, it was a silhouette, like a shadow of a person. A black mass, without face, without features, but human in form. Like the shadow of a man in a dimly lit room. I blinked, and the figure disappeared. But before I could breathe a sigh of relief, I heard quick footsteps running up the stairs. I jumped up from the couch and rushed after him. In my haste, I grabbed the only thing I could find, a blueprint case in the corridor. I went upstairs as fast as I could, but when I was on the last step, I heard a deafening boom. The door to the very room with the faulty light had slammed shut. It was like an electric shock. I stood in a stupor, unable to move, realizing that there was someone or something behind that door. I knew the room was blind. There were no windows, no way out. Something is imprisoned there, right behind that door. I stood in front of the door, where there was no telling who was behind it, and no telling what he wanted. My hands were soaking wet, clutching the tube, that my knuckles were white, the way I was gripping it so tightly. Well, what the hell? I'm in my own house. I'm not a little boy. Like a normal man, I'll just open the door and knock him out. Even if I break something, well, that's self-defense. I won't have a problem with the police. Taking a step towards the door, I reached for the handle and started to open it. And God, at that moment, 3 hard thuds hit the door from the other side, and the door slammed shut. What can I tell you? I don't know. I've never been so scared in my life. I jumped away from the door. I swung for a punch, thinking he was gonna jump out. But suddenly, there was silence, just dead silence. I waited for a moment, and then I opened the door. And what do I see? Nothing, and nobody is here. I looked behind the door. I looked in the cupboard, empty. I can't tell you how shocked I was. What was that? What the hell was that? What the hell is going on here? What the hell is going on here? I went downstairs trying to find my mobile phone. My hands were shaking. I was in shock. I didn't know what was going on. How is this even possible? What do I do now? Do I call the police? What do I say? Breaking and entering. Where did the burglar go? What do I say? He ran up to the first floor, locked himself in a windowless room and disappeared. Was there anyone there at all? Maybe I'm dreaming, or maybe I'm just going crazy. I need to calm down. I've got to find a doctor. Who the hell is a doctor? I'm not crazy. And there really was someone in there. Well, then where did he go? I had so many questions, I couldn't come up with one decent answer. I opened the bar and decided to have a drink. Yeah, that's what I need. I need to de-stress and calm down. The next morning, I woke up with a bad headache. There was a half-empty bottle of whiskey by the sofa. It looked like I'd had too much to drink last night, trying to relieve the stress. As soon as I came to my senses, I headed upstairs. Everything was calm in the house. It was just like a house. I calmly went up to the first floor, and everything was fine there too. The doors to the room were open like I left it. I asked loudly, "Is anyone here? Come out." All I heard was silence in response. Shit, what am I doing? I ask a question and wait for an answer. Or wait for the thief who broke into the house at night, or whatever, to come out a few hours later and go, "Hey mate, sorry to scare you in that, I'm out of here." What the fuck is going on with me? Well, what would you do if you were me? A lot of you would say I met a ghost or a poltergeist or something. In the past, I'd just laugh and say, "You're a weirdo." But now I don't know. I can't logically explain what happened, making up excuses that I'm tired or imagined or poisoned or whatever. It's not for me. I know what I saw and I know what happened, but I can't explain it. I checked the house again from top to bottom and found nothing. I closed all the windows and doors in the house and went to work. I couldn't work at all, always trying to figure out what it was. Started surfing the internet, but except for all sorts of nonsense about ghosts and the paranormal, videos like with people conducting investigations in some house in which when someone died, in general, one water, all the same type. Yes, there are people who really saw something or believe in something. They have it expressed in their eyes. I'm talking about eyewitnesses, not some bloggers or show hosts. A person's eyes can say a lot. There is either a wild horror or a complete lack of understanding. Not understanding that reality is not what you imagined it to be. After a few hours of watching and reading, I decided that I would test a few ideas at home. Back home, sitting at my laptop in the evening, I received a call from my brother via video link. We were discussing planning issues, and he wanted to know about the plot and building plans. Suddenly his daughter appeared on my screen and waved hello to me. I smiled and waved back at her too. And at that moment, a photo frame that was hanging on the wall fell behind my back. I turned around and saw the glass frame on the floor. I pushed back my chair and stood up from the table. I went to the frame and wanted to pick it up, and a sharp, childish laughter. I turned to the laptop screen and saw my niece smiling and waving at the camera. But I know I'm out of the frame and she can't see. I got a chill down my spine. And the worst part was when my brother said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know you had company." I just broke out in a sweat. I was alone at home, and I told my brother, and I saw him surprised, and he said he saw a shadow flicker down the corridor, and he's sure that's how someone walked past the door. The house on Wakehurst Parkway, whispers from the past. In the northern part of Sydney, where winding roads cut through dense forests, lies Wakehurst Parkway, an area steeped in myths and chilling stories. Locals avoid talking about this stretch of road, particularly about the houses nearby. One of the legends revolves around a house tucked away at the edge of the road, hidden behind towering trees. The house became the epicenter of mysterious events, its windows long shattered. No one dared to step near its threshold. But Jessica Dowett, a young journalist from Sydney, didn't believe in myths. She decided to uncover the truth about the haunted house, despite warnings from her friends and colleagues. It all started with an article Jessica stumbled upon while combing through the archives of a local newspaper. The text, dating back to the 1940s, described the mysterious disappearance of a family who lived in the house near Wakehurst Parkway. Every member of the family vanished without a trace, leaving behind strange markings on the walls and faint signs of a struggle. Local police insisted they found no evidence of foul play, and the case was soon closed due to a lack of leads. But years later, strange occurrences began to plague the road near the house. Drivers claimed their cars suddenly stalled in certain sections. Some even spoke of a ghostly figure in white who appeared on the roadside only to vanish as quickly as she came. Jessica decided this was the perfect subject for her next article. She planned to dig deep into the case and find out what really happened in that house. Her first step was meeting with local residents to gather more information. One of the longtime locals, Marion Richardson, told Jessica that in the 1960s, she and her husband had experienced odd things when driving past that house. Marion claimed their car would lose control as they neared the old property, and the air inside the vehicle would grow icy, even during Sydney's summer heat. One of Jessica's most compelling sources was a man named Thomas Burns, a former mechanic. He swore that one night while driving home along Wakehurst Parkway, he saw a strange figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman dressed in white, her face partially obscured by long dark hair. Thomas slammed on the brakes, but when he got out of the car, the figure had disappeared. Shaken, he tried to start the engine, but the car wouldn't respond. This happened mere meters from the old house. He sat there for half an hour before the engine roared back to life. Thomas vowed never to drive on that road at night again. Jessica's curiosity grew. She decided to drive down Wakehurst Parkway late one evening, despite all the warnings. The night was dark, and the road was eerily empty. Every now and then, strange creaking noises filled the silence in her car, but she dismissed them, blaming her aging vehicle. As she approached the house, an unnatural cold filled the car, and her headlights flickered before dying altogether. Her car stalled. An overwhelming sense of tension and dread washed over Jessica. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw something unnerving. A pale figure stood just a few yards behind her car, barely illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. It was the same woman, dressed in white. Jessica's heart raced as she turned her head, but the figure was gone. Panic set in, and she frantically tried to restart the car, but the engine remained silent. In the stillness, she heard a whisper, soft and chilling, as if someone was speaking directly into her ear. "Help me," the voice breathed. Jessica bolted from the car and ran toward the old house. The door was ajar. Inside, everything was abandoned, the walls cracked, the furniture covered in layers of dust. But on one of the walls, something strange caught her eye. It wasn't just random scratches. Words had been carved into the decaying surface. "We are here. We are waiting." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. A creeping unease gripped her, as if the house itself was watching her. Then, from deep within the hallway, she heard a rustling noise. Her feet felt glued to the floor, but something inside compelled her to keep moving forward. Step by step, she approached the end of the corridor, where an old, locked door stood. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the house. The door creaked open slightly, and a faint beam of light spilled out from inside. Jessica pushed the door open. The room was small, but bathed in a strange, glowing light, as if time had stood still. On the floor lay an old newspaper, open to an article about the family's disappearance in this very house. The family photo was clear, and Jessica's heart froze. The woman in the picture looked exactly like the figure she had seen on the road. But the most terrifying discovery was the headline. "The Dowett Family Disappearance. The Curse of the Wakehurst Parkway House." It was her surname. How was this possible? Terror consumed her. She threw the newspaper aside and ran out of the house, but the ghostly figure of the woman reappeared on the road, now much closer. Her face was twisted and deformed, and she was reaching out to Jessica as if trying to convey something vital. At that moment, Jessica's car roared back to life on its own. Without hesitation, she jumped in and sped away. Weeks passed after that night, but Jessica was no longer the same. She tried to make sense of what had happened, but there were no answers. The ghostly woman on the road, the newspaper with her family name, it all seemed impossible, yet undeniably real. Jessica's article on Wakehurst Parkway became her most popular piece. People from all over called to share their own experiences, recounting how their cars had stalled on that stretch of road, or how they had seen the phantom woman. But one call disturbed her more than any other. A man's voice on the line said, "You saw her. Now she's with you forever." His words were chilling, and they sank deep into her core. Shadows of the pages. In 2005, the Randolph family, consisting of Jack and Meg, moved to a quiet town called Westport in New Zealand. The move marked the beginning of a new life, far from the noise of big cities and constant hustle. Jack, an avid fan of the paranormal, had spent years collecting antique items related to the occult and mysticism. For several years, he had been searching for unusual books, articles, and artifacts, but nothing truly special had come his way. One day, while wandering through a market of old curios in the center of town, Jack stumbled upon a small antique shop. The shelves were filled with ancient statuettes, worn-out books, and various artifacts. One item immediately caught his eye: a small old book with a leather cover and faded golden letters on it. The title was barely legible, but Jack felt it was exactly what he had been looking for. The book appeared to be a manuscript that had passed through many hands, and its age was no less than 200 years. The shopkeeper was quiet, and when Jack asked about the book, the man briefly said, "Not the best choice." But that only piqued his interest further. Jack, despite the warning, bought it, convincing himself that the shopkeeper's fears were just superstitions. He was sure that he had found something rare. Meg had been skeptical from the beginning. She never shared her husband's passion for the paranormal and didn't understand why they needed to clutter their home with all this nonsense. But Jack was thrilled, and her concerns seemed to him unjustified. When they returned home, he immediately started leafing through the book, studying texts written in Latin. It turned out to be an ancient treatise on occult practices, describing rituals and mystical rites that he had only heard about before. The first night after purchasing the book passed peacefully. But by the second day, Meg started noticing strange things. Early in the morning, as she got up to make coffee, she felt something cold brush against her shoulder. She turned around, but saw no one, though for a brief moment she thought she saw a shadow flicker in the corner of the kitchen. She chalked it up to fatigue and stress from the move, but the feeling of unease stayed with her throughout the day. By evening, the tension between her and Jack had grown. He became withdrawn and irritable. Meg tried to talk to him, to ask what was going on, but he brushed her off, insisting it was nothing. He claimed the book was perfectly safe, but couldn't explain why strange things had started happening in their home. On the third day after buying the book, the manifestations became even more evident. Meg heard someone walking around the house while Jack was at work. She clearly heard heavy footsteps echoing through the hallway, but every time she left the room to check, there was no one there. Doors began to close by themselves, even though the windows and doors were tightly shut. Once, while passing the mirror in the bathroom, she noticed that her reflection appeared distorted, almost as if someone else was staring back at her from the other side. Jack seemed oblivious to these events, or he pretended not to notice. He had become obsessed with the book, spending all his free time with it. Meg noticed that he had stopped sleeping properly, and his mood had worsened. Gradually, he became more and more isolated, and something foreign appeared in his eyes. A week after the purchase of the book, Meg couldn't take it anymore and insisted they talk about what was happening. "Can't you see what's going on?" she yelled as she once again heard footsteps in an empty room. But Jack just waved her off as if everything happening didn't matter. "It's just your imagination," he said, not even looking up from the book. That night, everything changed. Jack was sitting in his study, as usual, absorbed in his reading when Meg heard a loud knock on the door. At first, she thought it might be the wind or someone accidentally hitting the door from outside. But then the knocking came again, this time much louder, as if someone was insistently trying to get in. Meg approached the door, but there was no one there. A chilling cold enveloped her, as if something horrible was coming from deep within the house. Suddenly, without warning, the lights went out. She stood in the darkness, hearing something heavy moving around the house. She ran back to Jack, but when she entered the room, his face was grim and terrifying. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, but he didn't respond. He just kept reading, as if he wasn't the man she once knew. That night, Meg woke up to the feeling that someone was standing by her bed. Slowly, she opened her eyes and saw Jack, but his eyes were empty, like those of a doll. He stood still as if waiting for something. Meg leapt out of bed, and at that moment he began to speak, but it wasn't his voice. His words were incomprehensible, like the whispering of many voices, dark and haunting. She fled the house, grabbing nothing, and got into her car. She spent the whole night in the car near a nearby motel, too afraid to return home. The next morning, she tried to call Jack, but his phone was off. When she finally returned, the house felt empty. The book was lying on the table, and its pages were open to the final ritual. Since that day, Meg never saw Jack again. She tried to find an explanation, asking locals about the shop where they bought the book, but no one could give her an answer. Soon the house was sold, and she moved far away from that place. But even years later, she's haunted by the sounds of footsteps at night, as if something from the past is still following her. Silence after death. My father was always a man of his word, strict but fair. I grew up in a home where his authority was unquestionable. His death was unexpected and painful. Although he was already in his 70s, he was full of life, and in an instant, everything came to an end. A heart attack. How cliché it sounds, it seems like thousands of other people die of the same thing every day. But for me, it was a world collapsing into nothing. A few days after the funeral, I went back to my father's house to clean up. The house was old, with faded wallpaper and creaking wooden floors, but cozy. My father lived here alone, especially after my mother died 5 years ago. I was an only child, and the house belonged to me now. I probably should have sold it, but I wasn't ready to cut ties so quickly with the place where my entire childhood had been spent. I spent the first night in his bedroom, on the same mattress where my father had spent the last years of his life. It wasn't easy to fall asleep. Too many memories. The smell of his cologne, his voice that still seemed to be in the air. But the main thing was a sense of heaviness, of something unfinished. Dad was an incredibly pedantic man, always leaving everything in order. But this time, everything in the house seemed a little out of order, as if someone had shuffled things around, rearranged them. The chair in the corner of the kitchen, which I distinctly remember standing straight, was now moved. It wasn't something huge, but little things like this had accumulated in a short time. The first time something serious happened was on the 4th night. I woke up to hear the creaking of floorboards. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, measured. I froze, listening. The footsteps were distinct, traveling down the corridor beyond the door. At that moment, I thought it could have been anything. Maybe the wood in the house was drying out, or the wind was driving the old boards. But it was like my whole body was telling me, it wasn't that. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I lay there, holding my breath, feeling the skin on the back of my neck start to tingle. Several minutes passed, but no one came in. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, no one was there. From that point on, the nights began to feel like torture. Every time I went to bed, I expected to hear those footsteps again, and they came back, sometimes quietly, sometimes louder. A few times I thought it might just be my imagination, or that I was going through the stress of my father's death. But then things started happening that I couldn't explain. One night I woke up to a loud sound like something falling in the next room. I jumped out of bed and went there. Nothing had been knocked out in the living room, but the door to the attic was ajar. It had always been locked with a latch, as my father never used the attic after his health deteriorated. I walked over, feeling my breathing become confused, and tried to close the door. It wouldn't move. It was strange. The door, which had always closed freely, now seemed to resist my efforts. The next day I checked the hinges and the lock, but everything was fine. In time, the footsteps were no longer the only manifestation. One day I came home after work and found all the pictures of my father, which I had arranged on the shelves in the living room, upside down. No one but me could touch them. I started to question my sanity, but each thing was too real to be just a figment of imagination. The mirror was next. I found a clear palm print on it. I hadn't touched this mirror since the day I moved in, and I knew for a fact that its surface was clean. This print looked too fresh, as if someone had put their hand on it recently. When I told my best friend Mark about it, he decided to come over and spend the night at my house to prove that there was nothing wrong. But he too left in the morning, white with horror. He was a skeptic by nature, but after that night, he could no longer deny that something was going on in the house. He'd heard footsteps and seen the lights in the corridor go on and off by themselves. We tried videotaping the whole thing using an old camera I found in my dad's garage. But no matter what we did, the camera stopped working at the exact moments when something strange was happening. It was like it was playing tricks on us, defying our attempts to record everything. The most disturbing thing was when I started seeing my father. The first few times it was fleeting, his shadow flickering in the corner of my vision, his silhouette reflected in the window as I walked past. But then I began to see him more and more clearly. One night I woke up feeling someone sitting on the edge of my bed. My heart sank into my heels when I turned my head and saw my father's silhouette. He was sitting with his back to me, but I knew it was him. His slouching shoulders, the way his hands rested in his lap, it was all too familiar. I froze in horror, not daring to move. Then he began to stand up slowly, and when he turned to face me, I couldn't stand it and squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened my eyes, he was gone, but the sensation of his presence was still there. I could no longer deny the obvious. Something in this house might have been connected to his death. Maybe my father hadn't left completely, and now his spirit remained trapped within these walls. With each passing day, I could feel the tension building. I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, unable to sleep properly, unable to think of anything else but footsteps, sounds, and that unbearable feeling of my father's presence. Perhaps it was just stress and grief, but every day the fear crept deeper into my soul. On one of my last days in the house, when I had already decided it was time to leave, something final happened. I heard footsteps in the corridor again, but this time they didn't stop at the door. I felt the cold air envelop me as the bedroom door slowly opened. Standing on the threshold was my father. His face was grim. His eyes seemed empty. He didn't say a word, but his presence pressed on me harder than any words could express. I tore myself off the bed and ran out of the room. I couldn't stay here any longer. I abandoned the house, leaving everything as it was, never to return again. It's been months now, and I still can't figure out what was really going on in that house. Was it just my mind not coping with the loss of my father? Or was something really dark hiding behind those walls, feeding off my fears? I'll never find the answer. But one thing I do know is that there was something in this house that wouldn't leave me alone, and I hope it stays where I left it. Something is wrong in our house. I moved into this flat with my husband 6 months ago. A small one-bedroom in an old building near downtown Philadelphia seemed like the perfect fit. Spacious kitchen, high ceilings, antique wood floors. We immediately felt at home. But after a few months, when we were fully settled in and feeling accustomed to the rhythm of our new life, things started happening in our cozy nest that made us feel uncomfortable. At first, it was little things. Sometimes at night, I woke up to strange sounds like light footsteps, but I put it down to the dilapidated floors. An old building probably creaks at night. Besides, we have upstairs neighbors. Maybe one of them was up at night. Anyway, nothing particularly frightening. One day, coming home after work, I noticed that the dining chair had been moved out of place. At first, I thought my husband Jason had done it, forgetting to put the chair back in place. But when he returned, he confidently said he hadn't gone into the dining room. I didn't think much of it at the time, but soon things like this started happening more and more often. Chairs were moved, kitchen cupboards were ajar, even though I remembered I'd closed them before I left. Once in the kitchen, we found a knife lying on the floor, even though it had been put away in a drawer the previous evening. It was getting alarming, but it all seemed so insignificant that we just joked about it. Oh, it's our houseboy frolicking. But the night sounds became more and more distinct. Around 2 to 3 a.m., we started hearing someone clearly walking around the kitchen. The creaking of the floors was so obvious that it was impossible to confuse it with anything else. Sometimes you could hear something heavy being moved, like furniture being moved around. The first couple of nights I forced myself to ignore it. But one night, when I heard the sounds again, I decided to wake Jason. The two of us lay in the dark, listening, and he heard it too. Someone was clearly walking around the flat. Jason, though a skeptic by nature, became very tense that night. He got up and grabbed a torch, determined to see what was going on. To our surprise, there was no one in the kitchen, but the chair that usually stood by the table had been moved to the middle of the room. We began to discuss in earnest what could have been going on. There were no burglars, the doors were always locked, and the windows in the kitchen were closed. We didn't know what to think. The next day, we installed a simple camera in the kitchen. We wanted to catch at least a sound or image. And then at night, we heard noises again. The camera didn't show anything concrete, but sound. We listened to the recording several times. It sounded like someone was walking across the room and moving something around. However, there was no movement on the video. It was frightening, but we didn't know what to do. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the camera didn't capture the moment, or there was something wrong with the technique. In the end, we decided to just keep watching. But the situation got worse. A few nights later, I woke up to the TV switching on by itself. The screen was blinking as if it had lost signal, and something was moving around in the kitchen again. It wasn't just a shadow or noise. It now felt like someone or something was actually in our house. We started noticing that household appliances were turning on and off by themselves. The microwave oven started working in the middle of the night one day, and the coffee machine started turning on for no reason at all. I'd heard stories about how electromagnetic fields could cause such phenomena, but that didn't explain why furniture moved around, or why we both felt it as something real. One night, Jason went into the kitchen after we heard a loud creak. I didn't go with him. I stayed in the bedroom, but I could hear him slowly moving around the flat. Then suddenly the bedroom light started to flicker on and off, and I heard his voice, "Hey," as if he was calling for someone. I ran out into the kitchen, and Jason was standing in front of a cabinet. The doors opened and closed on their own, as if someone was standing there, unseen, shaking them. We both stood there, not knowing what to say. When it finally stopped, we walked silently back to the bedroom, feeling that our house was no longer safe. Several days passed, but the situation only got worse. The television switched on, the lamps flickered, the furniture in the flat was moved every night. We could no longer ignore what was happening. The most frightening moment was one night, when I suddenly woke up and saw our kitchen table slowly moving across the floor. It wasn't a hallucination. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jason woke up too and witnessed it. We didn't know what to do. We started looking for information about the previous occupants of this flat, but found nothing unusual. No one had died here, and there was no record of any strange events. We even called an electrician to check the wiring, but everything appeared to be fine. At that point, our fear had already turned into paranoia. We started sleeping with the lights on, hoping it would somehow help stop what was happening, but nothing changed. The decision to leave that flat came naturally. The final straw was when I discovered scratches on the bedroom door that clearly didn't come from pets. We just didn't have any. We moved out the following week. To this day, no one can explain what was going on in our flat. Were these really paranormal phenomena, or were we simply under the influence of something that cannot be explained by science? But one thing is certain. Never again do we want to find ourselves in a situation where in your own home you feel that it does not belong to you alone. The Murphy's house, a haunting that wouldn't let go. I still remember the first time I saw the house on Elm Street. It was 1974, and my husband Jack and I had finally saved enough to buy our first home. We were newlyweds back then, hopeful, with our whole lives ahead of us. The house wasn't perfect, a two-story in a modest neighborhood of West Pittston, Pennsylvania, but it was ours. I can still see it in my mind's eye. The faded white paint, the creaky wooden porch, the overgrown lawn. Nothing special, but it felt like a fresh start for our little family. Looking back now, I wonder if we would have ever moved in had we known what was waiting for us inside. It started small, almost unnoticeable. At first, it was just the little things that I brushed off as my imagination. Odd, whispering noises in the middle of the night, faint footsteps when no one was walking, and lights flickering for no apparent reason. Jack always laughed it off, saying it was an old house, and old houses made noises. "Nothing to worry about, Peg," he'd say. and I would try to believe him. Then one evening, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I felt a cold gust of air rush past me. The windows were all closed, and it was a warm summer night, so I couldn't explain it. A strange feeling of unease settled over me. I mentioned it to Jack, but again, he shrugged it off. But soon, I couldn't ignore what was happening. The noises escalated. We began hearing loud thumping sounds, like someone slamming a door or dropping something heavy upstairs. But when we would investigate, nothing was out of place. At first, I thought it was just settling noises, the kind you expect in old houses, but they were getting louder and more frequent. One night, as we were sitting in the living room, I heard a scream. It was faint, like it came from far away, but it was unmistakable. I jumped up, my heart racing, and looked at Jack, expecting him to be just as alarmed, but he didn't seem to hear it. "You didn't hear that?" I asked. He shook his head. "Peg, you've been working too hard. You need some rest." But rest didn't come. Every night, the noises became more persistent, and I could sense something was watching us. The first time I actually saw it, I was alone. Jack had gone out for groceries, and I was folding laundry in our bedroom. Out of nowhere, the closet door creaked open slowly. I froze, laundry in my hands, watching the door as if expecting someone to step out. But no one did. My heart was pounding in my chest as I approached the door. Suddenly something darted past me, a shadow, quick and fleeting. It was like a figure made of darkness, there one moment and gone the next. I stood there, paralyzed, staring into the now empty closet. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I remember shaking, my hands cold and clammy. Ed and Lorraine conducted an investigation, and what they uncovered was more terrifying than I could have imagined. According to Lorraine, the house was infested with multiple malevolent entities, drawn to the suffering and fear that had accumulated over the years. She described them as poltergeists, restless spirits feeding off the chaos in our lives. They believed that the house had become a battleground for these spirits, and we were caught in the crossfire. The Warrens attempted several cleansing rituals, but each time the activity would subside for a few days and then come back even stronger. The house itself seemed to resist their efforts, as if the spirits were holding on to it, refusing to let go. They suggested we consider leaving, but financially we had no other option. This was our home, and we had nowhere else to go. In 1977, after years of torment, Father O'Donnell agreed to perform an exorcism. It was a last resort, and none of us were sure it would work. The night before the exorcism, the house seemed to come alive with activity. Doors slammed shut, windows rattled in their frames, and we heard guttural growls echoing through the halls. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The exorcism took hours. Father O'Donnell prayed over every room, sprinkling holy water, reciting scripture. At first, nothing seemed to happen. But then, as he entered the living room, a deafening roar filled the house. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and I felt something brush past me, cold and angry. But Father O'Donnell didn't stop. He kept praying, his voice steady and strong. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The house fell silent. For the first time in years, the house felt calm. The oppressive weight that had hung over us seemed to lift. We didn't dare believe it at first, but as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the activity slowly faded. There were still occasional noises, but nothing compared to what we had endured. It wasn't until years later, in 1992, that we finally moved out of that house. Even though the activity had mostly subsided, the memories never left us. To this day, I sometimes wonder if the spirits truly left, or if they're just waiting for their next victim. The house on Elm Street still stands. I've heard that no one has stayed there for long. Maybe the spirits are still there, watching, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of calling it home. Jack came home to find me sitting on the bed, pale and trembling. I tried to tell him what I saw, but the words felt foolish as they left my mouth. "It was just a shadow," he said, pulling me close. "You've been spooked by all those noises, that's all." I didn't argue, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong in this house. Days turned into weeks, and the activity escalated. Objects began to move on their own. I'd find furniture shifted from one side of the room to the other. The television would turn on and off without anyone touching it. And once, the kitchen faucet turned on full blast in the middle of the night. We started to argue more frequently, both of us on edge from the sleepless nights and constant tension. But it wasn't until the attacks began that we truly understood the danger we were in. One evening, as I was tucking our daughter Erin into bed, she gasped and pointed toward the corner of the room. "Mommy, who's that?" she whispered. I turned and saw a dark figure standing in the corner, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't human, more like a distorted shadow with no discernible face, just a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with malice. I grabbed Erin and rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Jack ran upstairs, but by the time he got there, the figure had vanished. That night, something worse happened. I woke up to the feeling of hands around my neck, squeezing. Gasping for breath, I thrashed in bed, trying to get free, but there was no one there. Jack woke up and grabbed me, shaking me awake. "Peg, what's wrong?" he shouted. But I couldn't speak, tears streaming down my face. I had felt those hands. I knew I had. We were desperate for help. Jack, who had always been skeptical, finally admitted that something was wrong with the house. We reached out to Father O'Donnell from the local church, who came to bless the house. For a few days, things seemed calm, but the relief didn't last long. The attacks grew more vicious. Jack was scratched by invisible claws in the middle of the night, deep enough to draw blood. The children began waking up with bruises and scratches. And worst of all, Erin started sleepwalking, wandering through the house as if something was guiding her. It wasn't until we contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned paranormal investigators, that we started to understand the true nature of what was tormenting us. They came to the house in early 1975, and I'll never forget the look on Lorraine's face when she walked inside. Her normally calm and composed demeanor faltered, and I could see the fear in her eyes. Ed and Lorraine conducted an investigation, and what they uncovered was more terrifying than I could have imagined. According to Lorraine, the house was infested with multiple malevolent entities, drawn to the suffering and fear that had accumulated over the years. She described them as poltergeists, restless spirits feeding off the chaos in our lives. They believed that the house had become a battleground for these spirits, and we were caught in the crossfire. The Warrens attempted several cleansing rituals, but each time the activity would subside for a few days and then come back even stronger. The house itself seemed to resist their efforts, as if the spirits were holding on to it, refusing to let go. They suggested we consider leaving, but financially we had no other option. This was our home, and we had nowhere else to go. In 1977, after years of torment, Father O'Donnell agreed to perform an exorcism. It was a last resort, and none of us were sure it would work. The night before the exorcism, the house seemed to come alive with activity. Doors slammed shut, windows rattled in their frames, and we heard guttural growls echoing through the halls. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The exorcism took hours. Father O'Donnell prayed over every room, sprinkling holy water, reciting scripture. At first, nothing seemed to happen. But then, as he entered the living room, a deafening roar filled the house. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and I felt something brush past me, cold and angry. But Father O'Donnell didn't stop. He kept praying, his voice steady and strong. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The house fell silent. For the first time in years, the house felt calm. The oppressive weight that had hung over us seemed to lift. We didn't dare believe it at first, but as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the activity slowly faded. There were still occasional noises, but nothing compared to what we had endured. It wasn't until years later, in 1992, that we finally moved out of that house. Even though the activity had mostly subsided, the memories never left us. To this day, I sometimes wonder if the spirits truly left, or if they're just waiting for their next victim. The house on Elm Street still stands. I've heard that no one has stayed there for long. Maybe the spirits are still there, watching, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of calling it home. A night at the airport. I flew to Tanzania with 2 connections. The last flight had already left, and the airport happened to be closed from midnight until 4 in the morning. I was in for a night of waiting. Although the airport is guarded and apparently safe, I soon realized how wrong I was. 23:37. Arrival. My flight was delayed due to bad weather, and I found myself in a small airport that was more like a ghost, empty and almost deserted. It turned out I wasn't the only one stuck here. 2 other planes had also arrived late. Several passengers were waiting for their early morning flights, as was I. Around midnight, the airport began to quiet down. I found a seat on a bench and settled in for the night, expecting to just wait it out for a few hours. But at 1 a.m., things started to change. Suddenly, the lights went out. All that was left was a dim emergency light. A security guard passing by assured us that this was due to bad weather and that we had nothing to worry about. At 1:27 a.m., I started to fall asleep. All was quiet until suddenly a sharp ringing echoed through the empty building. I turned my head sharply in the direction of the sound. The other passengers also turned in fright. It turned out to be a girl's mobile phone. I tried to go back to sleep, but something was starting to get on my nerves. 2. A sharp scraping of metal against glass broke the silence, so shrill it gave me goosebumps all over. And then laughter. But not just any laughter, a sinister laughter, like in the worst horror films. I turned around to see all the passengers looking down the corridor in panic. The security guard, who had walked down the aisle a while earlier, was standing at the end, looking in the same direction. Then a woman sitting nearby jumped up and started screaming loudly, waving her arms. I could only make out one word: "Scusi." She was Italian, clearly panicked. The guard, clearly not knowing what to do, picked up a torch and walked down the corridor. We all followed him, as if expecting him to dispel this growing fear. The light of the torch went down the dark corridor, but there was no one there. The guard walked on, turned a corner, and the lantern light suddenly disappeared. We all froze, afraid to breathe. The minutes stretched on like an eternity. The guard didn't come back. I felt my heart begin to race. What had happened out there? The woman began to scream again, but this time her voice was louder, almost hysterical. We were all on edge. Fear had already set in. Someone offered to go after the guard, but most of us froze, afraid to move. And then from the corner of the corridor came soft but sure footsteps. Everyone froze. Attention hung in the air, as if time had stood still. But instead of the guard, a silhouette emerged from the darkness. His face was hidden in the shadows, and as he took a step forward, the light from the emergency lights illuminated his form. But instead of the guard, someone else was looking at us. The figure was strange, unnaturally bent, with a dim, almost dead light in its eyes. The footsteps came closer. My body felt petrified with fear. I could feel the cold sweat on my back, my muscles tensed to the limit. The figure came closer, and then there was a woman's shrill scream. I turned to see her running for the exit, but the doors were locked. We were trapped. I stood there paralyzed, watching the figure approach. The footsteps echoed in the empty hall, each sound like a hammer blow. The figure kept coming, and with each step I felt the air around me grow colder. The emergency lights flickered, as if resisting the presence of something alien. The woman who had just screamed ran to the doors, but they remained closed. She pulled at the handles in panic, trying to force them open, but to no avail. Her screams became desperate, and she began to pound on the glass with her fists, trying to attract help from outside. But it was dark and lifeless, as if the world outside the airport walls had disappeared. A figure stopped a few yards away, and I realized it wasn't a security guard. This man, or what looked like a man, was strangely contorted. His body seemed abnormally long, and his limbs overly elongated, as if they were not designed to move as they should. The face, if it could be called a face, was gray, with empty eyes that stared straight at us. but did not express an ounce of life. At that moment, the silence in the hall became unbearable. The passengers nearby could not move either. No one wanted to attract the attention of this creature. But I had the feeling it could see all of us. The seconds passed like hours. I didn't know what to do. Run away? But where to? We're locked in here and it's dark outside the window. Try to talk? But to what? To whom? Suddenly I felt his gaze on me, cold and penetrating. The figure took another step forward. I noticed that his fingers were strangely outstretched, as if reaching for me. The woman at the door screamed again, waking the others. The passengers started to get up, screaming, trying to hide or run away into the darkness. Some ran to the far corner of the hall. Others tried to hide behind benches, as if that would save them. But it was all in vain. The figure kept moving, its steps becoming faster and more determined. And then suddenly the light came back on. The emergency lights lit up the hall, and I saw that the figure had disappeared. I started breathing heavily, trying to regain control of my body, and only then did I realize that all the passengers were on the verge of hysteria. The woman at the door was sitting on the floor with her hands over her face, crying. The other passengers were standing there, looking around as if they couldn't believe the nightmare was over. But it wasn't over. The guard had not returned. It had been over an hour since he'd left to check the corridor. Passengers began to talk among themselves, some suggesting they try to find the exit again, but most were afraid to go in the direction the guard had gone. I was confused too. What had happened? A dream? A vision? But the feeling of terror and cold I felt was all too real. Time passed agonizingly slowly. We tried to calm down, to find a rational explanation. I sat down on the bench and noticed that the other passengers had begun to move back towards the light. No one wanted to stay in the shadows. At 3:15 a.m., the following happened. The doors leading into the deserted terminal slowly began to open by themselves. The creaking sound was so loud that it made everyone freeze. No one wanted to move. But this event made us all pay attention. The corridor outside the doors was completely dark, with no light coming in. One of the passengers, a middle-aged man, stood up and started moving towards the doors, as if being pulled there. I tried to call out to him, but it was as if he didn't hear me. The others also noticed that something was wrong with him, but no one dared to take a step in his direction. He walked to the open doors and stood for a moment. Then he took a step inside. At that moment, the lights flickered again, and we heard a loud bang, as if someone had closed the door with incredible force. The man had disappeared. He simply walked away into the darkness and never came back. Screams echoed through the hall again. It was panic. Now we knew for sure that something supernatural was going on here that could not be explained. And we realized that morning was still too far away. We sat for about an hour at the front doors, all huddled together in one tight circle. No one wanted to move too far away from the others, and every sound made us flinch. Tension hung in the air, and it felt like time had stopped. Suddenly, a bright headlight cut through the darkness. We all shuddered with surprise, and someone even shrieked. But it was a car approaching the airport. And then the light came back. The whole airport was illuminated again, as if nothing had happened. The billboards lit up, the emergency lights went out, and the corridors were filled with the familiar yellow glow of lamps. But one thing still troubled us. Where was the guard and the man who had gone into the dark corridor? We ran to the door and started knocking, trying to attract attention. After a few minutes, another guard came from the other side. He opened the door and looked at us in bewilderment. We all started to tell him what had happened, but he seemed puzzled and didn't fully understand what we were saying. The guard called someone on the radio, and in 15 minutes the airport was filled with people. Police, medics, airport employees. Everyone was bustling around, interviewing us, checking cameras and searching the area. I told the police everything I had seen. Other passengers shared their stories too. But no one at the airport could find the security guard or the passenger who had gone into the dark corridor. It seemed like they just disappeared. A couple of days later, I finally flew out and tried to forget about what happened that night. But at one of the transfer points, sitting at a bar, I overheard two tourists talking. They were talking about the recent news. 2 bodies, a security guard and a passenger, had been found at a small airport. The authorities announced that it was a robbery that ended in tragedy, but something about it didn't add up. One of the tourists mentioned that he had heard from local airport workers that the bodies had been torn to pieces, as if someone or something had destroyed them with inhuman force. I wondered, what had happened that night was no ordinary robbery. I was sure the authorities were hiding the truth, but what exactly was lurking in those dark corridors of the airport? What were the authorities hiding? What made the security guard and the passenger disappear? I didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. It was something much more sinister than a simple robbery. And maybe there was something else waiting for its next victims in this airport. And then suddenly the light came back on. The emergency lights lit up the hall, and I saw that the figure had disappeared. I started breathing heavily, trying to regain control of my body. And only then did I realize that all the passengers were on the verge of hysteria. The woman at the door was sitting on the floor with her hands over her face, crying. The other passengers were standing there, looking around as if they couldn't believe the nightmare was over. But it wasn't over. The guard had not returned. It had been over an hour since he'd left to check the corridor. Passengers began to talk among themselves, some suggesting they try to find the exit again, but most were afraid to go in the direction the guard had gone. I was confused too. What had happened? A dream? A vision? But the feeling of terror and cold I felt was all too real. Time passed agonizingly slowly. We tried to calm down, to find a rational explanation. I sat down on the bench and noticed that the other passengers had begun to move back towards the light. No one wanted to stay in the shadows. At 3:15 a.m., the following happened. The doors leading into the deserted terminal slowly began to open by themselves. The creaking sound was so loud that it made everyone freeze. No one wanted to move, but this event made us all pay attention. The corridor outside the doors was completely dark, with no light coming in. One of the passengers, a middle-aged man, stood up and started moving towards the doors, as if being pulled there. I tried to call out to him, but it was as if he didn't hear me. The others also noticed that something was wrong with him, but no one dared to take a step in his direction. He walked to the open doors and stood for a moment. Then he took a step inside. At that moment, the lights flickered again, and we heard a loud bang, as if someone had closed the door with incredible force. The man had disappeared. He simply walked away into the darkness and never came back. Screams echoed through the hall again. It was panic. Now we knew for sure that something supernatural was going on here that could not be explained. And we realized that morning was still too far away. We sat for about an hour at the front doors, all huddled together in one tight circle. No one wanted to move too far away from the others, and every sound made us flinch. Tension hung in the air, and it felt like time had stopped. Suddenly, a bright headlight cut through the darkness. We all shuddered with surprise, and someone even shrieked. But it was a car approaching the airport, and then the light came back. The whole airport was illuminated again, as if nothing had happened. The billboards lit up, the emergency lights went out, and the corridors were filled with the familiar yellow glow of lamps. But one thing still troubled us. Where was the guard and the man who had gone into the dark corridor? We ran to the door and started knocking, trying to attract attention. After a few minutes, another guard came from the other side. He opened the door and looked at us in bewilderment. We all started to tell him what had happened, but he seemed puzzled and didn't fully understand what we were saying. The guard called someone on the radio, and in 15 minutes the airport was filled with people. Police, medics, airport employees. Everyone was bustling around, interviewing us, checking cameras and searching the area. I told the police everything I had seen. Other passengers shared their stories too. but no one at the airport could find the security guard or the passenger who had gone into the dark corridor. It seemed like they just disappeared. A couple of days later, I finally flew out and tried to forget about what happened that night. But at one of the transfer points, sitting at a bar, I overheard two tourists talking. They were talking about the recent news. 2 bodies, a security guard and a passenger, had been found at a small airport. The authorities announced that it was a robbery that ended in tragedy, but something about it didn't add up. One of the tourists mentioned that he had heard from local airport workers that the bodies had been torn to pieces, as if someone or something had destroyed them with inhuman force. I wondered, what had happened that night was no ordinary robbery. I was sure the authorities were hiding the truth, but what exactly was lurking in those dark corridors of the airport? What were the authorities hiding? What made the security guard and the passenger disappear?